Welcome to tonight's episode of the Dead Astrologers Society. I'm Donna Woodwell, your host for the evening, and I am here with two of my favorite people. Will Morris, who is an acupuncturist and an astrologer and a musician here in Austin, Texas, and Enid Newberg, the astrologer and president of Kepler College. And tonight, we will be talking on episode 10 of the Dead Astrologers Society about John Dee. Now, John Dee, one of my all-time favorite astrologers on the planet. I'm using the word favorite a lot tonight, so you can tell what kind of a mood I'm in. John Dee was a famous Elizabethan astrologer and the original 007. And as I was saying before the episode started tonight, let's make sure by the end of it, everyone realizes that yes, 007 was indeed an astrologer. So to hear more about that story, I'm going to start bringing our guests here. Enid and Will, say hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes,
well,
indeed.
the rules are the same as always. We are here to talk about our love for astrology throughout history and time. And if you are tuning in on the website, you may always use the chat room to give us a shout out. If you have questions and things you'd like our guests to answer, we'll try to incorporate them in the show. So without further ado, let's start talking about John Dee. Now, Will, this was your idea for an episode, so maybe you can start us out with telling us a little bit about who John Dee was and why he's important as a dead astrologer.
Well, certainly John Dee had a significant influence upon the practice of astrology, but also the entirety of the Western mystery tradition as we know it today is highly influenced by his presence. And of course, he did time the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I's chart. He did the chart for that coronation, and it proved to be pretty good, but over time he did lose some of her matronage, if you will.
I'll say, let's go back to talk about John Dee's era. Now, I was looking into this morning when I was getting ready for the show, and it looks like it's this fascinating little window. It's right after the Italian Renaissance. John Dee was born just after Marsilio Ficino and the other Renaissance scholars were born, right after they died. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he was, I believe Kepler. Kepler, yes. And
well,
he was
he knew Tycho Brahe, so he probably knew.
That's
Kepler.
right. Yeah.
And he was, and William Lilly was born just a few years before John Dee died. So it's this space in between Marsilio Ficino and William Lilly that he occupies as an astrologer. So he's certainly got illustrious company throughout the course of his life. And I guess he was born into a reasonably well-to-do family for the time, correct?
Truly, yes. A vintner's son.
Who worked at the court, correct? He was in the court of
Yes.
King Henry. So as a child of some means of a family, he had access to education, which I would imagine people at the time, unless you had some kind of wealth and property in the family, education was something that was harder to come by.
That's right. He was also a bit of a child prodigy when it came to all of the liberal arts, mathematics, etc.
Mm-hmm. So from grade school, he went into Cambridge, St. John's College, if I remember correctly, where he met up with people who would become relatively famous in their own rights, being the tutor to the king and so on. So he was already starting to establish a network of connections, even at a relatively young age.
That's right. Those connections gave him access to the court.
And he did hang out at the court quite a bit, even before Elizabeth, his main... Well, I guess you said matronage. Now I'm sitting there trying to find, but I think calling her his main matron doesn't work so well.
So,
I mean, he nearly got himself in serious trouble by he was arrested as a conjurer because he did Queen Mary's chart without her permission and talked to Elizabeth about it, which was a big no-no.
Yeah, it's an interesting time in history because, to refresh the listeners who may not be familiar with the history of the English monarchy, we just had King Henry VIII on the throne, who was obviously the famous king who had 6 wives. A couple of them were beheaded, a couple divorced, and one died, and then one survived, as the old rhyme goes. And from those unions, he had 3 children. And the first became King Edward, the second became Queen Mary, and the third became Queen Elizabeth. And King Edward was relatively young on the throne, but he didn't last long. And I found it fascinating reading the stories about John Dee that he and some of his friends were looking at the horoscope for King Edward and going, I don't know how long this guy's going to be on the throne. And so they were kind of using astrology to predict the length of a reign, which made it a tool for international politics. I know I really never thought about this before, but you could predict or falsely predict a ruler's chart in order to create some kind of international fervor. And so then from there, we had John Dee and his friends, who were really progressive and looking forward to that golden age of the philosopher kings, had already kind of seen Elizabeth as a very smart child, precocious child. She eventually learned 6 languages as a possibility for a future ruler. And we're already making friends with her when she was really, really tiny. And they were her tutors. They're the ones who taught, who brought her up in the world. So, of course, she came and turned to them for advisors when she got on the throne. I thought that was fascinating. What did I miss out?
Well, I think
there's so much. There's so much in this man's life. It's very complicated, right? Enid, yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because he wasn't just the astrologer. He was and he played them well, John Dee did, as well as being renowned throughout Europe as an expert in mathematics. He was, let's see, what else? He was just known for, I know the other one that I found really fascinating about him was, as he was working with Queen Elizabeth, he was also accumulating a library where he had something like over 4,000 books at the time, when Cambridge University could boast about 450.
That's right. Yeah. He had the goal of, he was actually seeking from the crown support for establishing the largest collection of esoteric lore and mathematics and the contemporary alchemical works of the era there in England, and the crown did not support him. He created that out of his own pocket.
I can only imagine how expensive that would have been at the time.
Yeah, 4,000 books at that time. And yeah.
But he also, he was really generous with his books, because other people would come and do research at his library. I think I read one place where the Globe Theatre for Shakespeare, the famous Shakespearean theater, was based on a design from someone who had researched how to do a theater through John Dee's books. Whoops. We're having computer issue.
I think so.
Okay, looks like it might have cleared.
You think?
Good.
Okay, we should be doing Mercury.
So along the lines, Mercury's retrograde, yes.
This is what happens when Mercury goes retrograde. You can't hear everybody.
That's right. But he did have Shakespearean connections. Prospero and King Lear,
were modeled off of the idea of John Dee.
Right, as was the contemporary 007.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he actually used the number 007, right?
Yeah, John
Yes, he
Dee, when
did.
he signed his correspondence, because he was associated with the monarchy, he spent times in courts overseas, sometimes as the advocate for the monarchy, and sometimes, whether it was pretense or not, that he was somehow fleeing from the monarchy. And he may have even been, feeding information back to them. Sort of from his position of black sheep, people would tell him them secret information, which he would immediately send back to the spy master in England.
Right.
He signed all of his correspondence, 007.
Right, as a double agent in some instances, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He was the queen's eyes, and so he had these two circles with the...
That's
but
right.
he was, that second time when you were saying he was sort of fleeing the court, that was, to me, is one of the interesting times of his life, because that's when he hooks up with Edward Kelly. You mentioned him, who wasn't he already in jail, or had a terrible reputation in England?
Yeah, he would make up these boxes that were supposedly capable of generating gold from alchemical procedures, and then he would somehow sell them for an exorbitant fee. And one time he got caught, and they cut his ear off. And he was imprisoned at various points along the way. And then he somehow gained application to Dr. John Dee as an apprentice for alchemical works, and somehow managed to hide his sordid past and attain the job. And I guess he got tested one night by he was required to do some visioning work on behalf of Dr. Dee, and was successful in producing communications into the angelic realms on Dee's behalf. And as a result of that work, he was hired. And I guess over the time of their relationship, his nature became much more apparent.
Yeah. Didn't he finally die in prison?
Yeah.
Or actually an escape. I think it was an escape attempt from prison in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because by that point, John Dee had decided he'd had enough of him. Yeah.
But, I pulled up Kelly's chart here, and because I was curious, what was it about Kelly that made him, well, there was one of two things that happened, right? They created an entire angelic language called Enochian with interior syntax and structure that any linguist who studies the structuralism of language would be able to identify as a legitimate form of language. So regardless of whether he co-opted it from earlier sources or through the visioning process, that Enochian language is still in use today. And so looking at his chart, I thought, well, what is it? And we have a pretty nice little trine between Neptune and Mercury, which would provide a good, Neptune mystical revelation, and Mercury, and having a harmonious aspect makes it entirely possible for him to bring those kind of subtle realm experiences into an articulation via language, or that is Mercury.
Or at least put on a really good show with it.
Well, yeah, apparently.
Yeah, in their travels through Europe, they were invited to quite a few of the courts, even some of the Catholic courts that were very suspicious over doing this spiritualist stuff that, was, and I think now I'm trying to remember which one of those courts where they actually had a priest specifically to make sure that nothing trespassed over what was proper and appropriate for, since it was treading on dangerous territory.
Sounds like the precursor for the Office of the Doctrine of the Faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of, but it was very popular, their shows that they did. Well, I don't think they called them shows, but that's essentially what it was. It was And it certainly did do a good number on tarnishing John Dee's reputation after he died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because nobody wanted to pay attention to the
it.
fact. Oh, I was just going to say that nobody seemed to pay attention afterwards to the fact that he was a mathematician, that he was instrumental in expanding the British Empire, that he was on the hunt for the Northwest Passage for Queen Elizabeth, and all these other really cool things. They just kind of went, oh yeah, he was this conjurer. What were you going to say, Will?
Well, it's odd because that it was actually that which left his mark as well. I mean, all the other things were actions that took place under the influence of other specialists within those domains. But he was certainly what one could classify as a Renaissance man. He was adept in chemistry, which was in that time period it was alchemy. His lab was the equivalent of Paracelsus. And one of the attractions for the royalty in some of these other countries, particularly Poland, was the potential they felt that he could come there and help them develop the power to make gold and subsequently gain sufficient military power to control the European arena. And he played that card fairly well, but he had so many skills, it was quite profound. And Edward Kelly did not help his reputation, and consequently, that put him in a less than desirable stead with the Queen. So she felt she had to distance herself from him due to the accusations of conjuration and so forth.
Although the Queen certainly had liked him earlier a lot also for his ability to do ciphers. I mean, that's where he was really excelled at his 007 role, is he was really good at doing the cryptic message.
And that's probably a large part of how he and his partner Kelly developed an intact angelic language. But those influences are what allowed him sufficient travel and concourse throughout the European arena to be able to acquire many of the texts that he was able to gain. And so there was an odd confluence of his activities and interests held by those folks that he participated with, the royalty, and he was able to gain exchanges that favored many of his interests.
Oh, I think you faded out.
Yeah, we're having audio problems. Mercury.
Hello.
Earth to Mercury.
One of the phrases he loved to make at the ending of doing a work with Kelly, or at the beginning of doing a work, when they were attempting their goal in this angelic endeavor, which was tied together with planetary forces. He oftentimes calculated charts for various events in his life, but in this instance, they were attempting to gain information from the angelic domain to inform their alchemical works, so they could ostensibly get to the point of generating gold, which of course was turned out to be a fallacy. But in any regard, for Paracelsus, it became the basis of contemporary pharmaceutical medicine. In fact. But before going into these works, he would say, "Arise, move, therefore, and appear. Open up the mysteries of your creation and make us partakers of undefiled knowledge." And this became a regular kind of invocation. Yes, opening statement to the works that he would pursue. But
precursor of the 1840s and 1850s seances.
Exactly.
Really? Exactly.
But he used charts for other purposes. He would calculate the chart every time his wife would have a period, and he would also calculate charts for every time that they engaged in conjugal relations.
Well, that must have worked. Didn't he have 8 kids out of his third wife, and he'd had a couple kids even before?
Yeah. That's right. There's a fairly strong argument for fertility methods in astrological practice.
Oh, dear. I mean, it sounds to me like, he was a true polymath. He wrote books when he was a teenager, or at least had the beginnings of books published. I don't know if they were officially published until later. He taught and lectured around Europe, became a tutor to royalty, went on diplomatic missions, as you said, excelled in navigation, and helped with putting together the charts for finding the Northwest Passage to Asia across the northern part of the North American continent. I mean, the list seems to go on of all the things that he did, but he was also really good with people. And some of his things, like his antiquarian love of books, opening his house to scholars. He must have had the most amazing people coming through his house, right? And as you said, he knew Tycho Brahe and other people of the time. And the Queen, I read, used to pay visits to him, just find out what he was up to. To have royalty coming and visiting your house is pretty impressive.
There supposedly also he met Francis Bacon. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And I don't know that he actually met Copernicus, but he was an early convert to the whole heliocentric, instead of having the new change in the Copernican orbits and everything that was pretty radical at the time.
Yeah.
So he was. But it's interesting because we hear the history of all these people, and we forget that through this time period, well, even into the, Newton was born just after John Dee, but he too, all of his genius was also, the majority of his writings are on alchemy. There wasn't this automatic that if you're a mathematician or a scientist, that would preclude you from also being interested in the spiritual side.
Absolutely, and to that end, he was heavily involved in the development of the Rosicrucian order, and as such was also a Hermeticist after the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, which is in a sense a Neoplatonic worldview that saw evolutionary states of consciousness related to the degree of expansion through the planetary spheres. So, for instance, being here on Earth and the moons close by and so forth. And a pretty rich spiritual adept who also was conversant in the Kabbalah and the applications of materials for the affective consciousness, which, of course, today we see used in the arena of psychiatry and medications that affect consciousness.
Yes, John Dee is now officially on my list of astrologers to be contacted with my Ouija board. Seriously, if he was doing all that angelic work, don't you think he would be at least sympathetic to being on the other side and, picking up the phone when the Ouija board calls?
Absolutely. I think it's worth finding out.
Well, we may have to put that on our Halloween special at this point. So, with that, we do have to take a break to share with you some of the other fabulous offerings that are going on the wonderful Paramania radio station. So, we will be back in a few to talk more about the exciting life and times of John Dee. See you then. And welcome back to our show on the Dead Astrologer Society, where we are talking about the magical, amazing John Dee with Enid Newberg and Will Morris. So, right before we left, we were talking about John Dee and the Rosicrucian Order. And I wanted to make sure we didn't cut off this subject because I feel like it's really a fascinating tale. Now, I read somewhere that John Dee actually created the Rosicrucians, and that seemed like it was a lot. But you were talking about it that he was part of a group that was instrumental in setting it up. So, Will, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the roots of Rosicrucian movement are not well defined, and however.
Well, for our listeners, let's start with what the Rosicrucians are. Maybe for the listeners who don't know what the Rosicrucian means.
Well, the Rosicrucian movement arose pretty close to the same time frame, or early Elizabethan, predating that, and it's a sort of a response, like a third stream of consciousness in response to Catholicism and Protestantism, that in a sense regained some forms of the ritual components, but were not necessarily beholden to the church, and had a fairly intellectual stream, and had a man named Christian Rosenkreutz as the personage at the fountainhead of the movement, and there were books published around the Rosicrucian movement at that time, and the Rosicrucian movement still exists today in a group called the Rosicrucians in Anglia, both here and in Europe. These movements remain.
So it's kind of like it's kind of like a mystical form of Christianity.
Go ahead. In essence, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so John Dee was one of the people helping to set that up.
That's correct. And it's taken form in several mystery schools that are in current practice today, and it deals with, you might say, a deep contemplative state that involves communication in spirit, much like prayer. Yeah.
And also astrology. Some of the early astrologers even in the 20th century were getting a lot of their knowledge of astrology from Rosicrucian printed texts.
That's right. That's right. And the knowledge and the beliefs are heavily rooted in Hermeticism, but also Christian Gnosticism. So there's a great deal of a belief in direct communication, a direct experience of some form of spirit. And of course, in John Dee's case, that took the form of angelic beings for which Dr. Dee would construct the ritual and the prayers and perform those. And then Edward Kelly would go into a trance with the crystal ball, and ostensibly the angel would come and speak then through Kelly, and Dee would record the utterings that would come forth from Kelly. And that became the body of their work, and there are extensive diaries and even facsimiles of those diaries in Dee's handwriting.
So in essence, they were doing what we might call channeling today.
Yes, it was certainly a form of channeling, yes. You might say a little bit more stilted, given the era in which they were operating. Whereas today, people may be a little bit more free and less ensconced of formalism, the kind of formalism that they were engaged in their practices.
Well, if you had to wear the clothes that they were wearing, I think you might be stiff and formal too. Yeah? I don't know, especially for the women. Once you get tied up in all those corsets, I don't know about relaxing. It's not your thing. So, to the end of John Dee's life. So he came back to England from his international travels. Elizabeth died in around 1503. 1603. And then John Dee died in about 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So when I guess James succeeded Elizabeth to the throne, and he was not nearly as open-minded, or he was not a patron. He's not a patron. So let's talk about what did happen in the last few years of his life.
Well, discretion became the better part of valor for anybody who was into the more occult side under King James. He didn't. I think he reinstated some witch hunting and a little bit of witch burning in his realm. So his attitude was pretty much the opposite of Elizabeth's. And John Dee basically retired to his home.
It was basically a swing from the left to the right.
Yep.
What we're saying. So retired to his home. Now, I mean, obviously he was from a reasonably well-off family. He had all those children. So I guess he got to be grandpa.
He gets to be grandpa. Now, the trip over into Europe wreaked havoc with his library, because evidently people stole some of his books, stole some of his instruments. So it wasn't so much of a happy time when he came back. And a lot of people in the writing, they really emphasize he died poverty-stricken and poor, and yet being the fact that most of his children lived to adulthood and were doing pretty well, I kind of have a hard time thinking that was the case, and maybe was more of the idea that he had fallen out of favor. So the proper way in those days for anybody to fall out of favor, of course, was to die in poverty.
Yeah, wasn't it one of his sons a doctor?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his daughter's married well, so it is kind of, I don't know, it seems like that they wouldn't completely just let him be abandoned by them.
Wandered the streets without a home. It's probably unlikely.
Yeah.
So, all of this, what is our legacy from John Dee's life for the arts and sciences, for culture, for astrology in general?
I think that part of what he's left behind in terms of astrology in general has to do with the emphasis of electional astrology, given the extraordinary influence of his selecting the coronation moment for Queen Elizabeth. But also, of course, the intrigue that he was tied to with her ascent to the throne gave weight to the applications of astrology in the socio-political arena.
And rumor has it he also was reassuring everybody on the Spanish Armada when that he was saying, nope, they're not going to be able to succeed. So he was pretty good at the horary side as well.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, his alchemical efforts were certainly overshadowed by that of Paracelsus, who was really the father of chemical forms of medical care. This influence remains present. His development of trigonometric method altered sea navigation significantly. He was employed as a map maker, so he developed map making trends. There's so many pieces of how we manage the material world today that he was a masterful, and not just masterful of the art, but also an originating contributor to the practices, such as the applications of geometric method and Euclidean geometry.
If I remember correctly, he also realized that there is a significant difference in times and places between magnetic north and true north.
Uh-huh.
Which I thought was interesting.
That was part of, he used to do a lot of work on with the sailors and the navigation voyages. So, I think that was all part of that. He had a huge amount of insight there. And in terms of just Britain becoming a major power, I suspect that you would have to give him some credit for his ability to develop as a 007 agent, the whole intrigue part and the cipher part of being able to keep secrets.
Yeah, he sold one manuscript as a cipher to be deciphered. It's called the Everest of Cipher Studies to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph. And this cipher manuscript still resides at the Yale libraries, at the Bernanke Library. So it just kind of goes on and on. It's phenomenal.
I mean, he was considered one of the most
pretty
learned men of his
amazing.
age.
Reaches out to so many areas.
After his,
Mm-hmm.
But it's what's amazing is that as everything became more and more strictly scientific, he really was relegated to obscurity for many, many years until recent times. His influence was kind of, he was there, but very carefully sort of, let's go on to something else. And in the past 20 years, 30 years, well, I guess more like 20, 25 years, all of a sudden he's returned to the stage with book after book.
Well, it's fascinating that many of the learned people of the time had backgrounds in astrology, like Tycho Brahe and Kepler, for example. And yet their biographies have somehow been sanitized to never mention the fact that they were astrologers or had interest in alchemy and other occult subjects. They're just pure science now because that's what's acceptable. And yet John Dee seems to have gotten all the shadow. He became the conjurer and the magician who was dismissed and died in poverty, even though he made these brilliant contributions to science along the way, developing maps and projection models and Euclidean geometry and all of these other things that we still use today. But they got lost in the weight of it's like that balance that the Egyptian books of the dead talks about. He had too much in the occult side, and so the balance just slipped for him.
Well, all social systems
he was
need
one of the most.
And I suppose he made a good one.
He did make a good scapegoat because he was kind of a bigger than life figure all the way through. So I suppose that it made a certain sense, especially, King James he must not have really liked, because he grew up with all this kind of woo-woo stuff, as I'm sure he was, judging from the way his attitude towards it growing up. And he was very, very fearful of this occult stuff. So I get the impression that he was kind of imprinted early on with this negative view that I'm sure that in court politics it was quite augmented by everyone else. So John Dee becomes he becomes the figures in Shakespeare and in other writings where he's kind of this combination between, yes, a wise old man, but also the scary figure.
Well, some of his naysayers were afraid that he had loosed through his
his practices, his ceremonial and magical practices, spirits upon England. And so there were certainly numerous individuals who sought his demise. So the fact that he died in obscurity without some active form of malevolence is actually a bit of a miracle, given the times and the risk of being subjected to accusation worse than conjuration, that of witchcraft, which was often the course of action for, let's say, a woman practicing herbal medicine on the outskirts of the city. That was not an uncommon accusation for folks operating in that community. So he was engaged in activities that were falling around the borderlands of acceptable societal behavior, which would be pretty conservative, especially once James came into play. But even in Elizabeth's court, there was a remarkable degree of conservatism, fundamentally arranged within the context of the church. And so, fortunately, the Rosicrucian order sustained a presence of Christian values, in a sense, and he sought that. And that was one of his disappointments with Kelly, is that Kelly wasn't expressing that, and somehow they came into contact with a young woman who Kelly had gotten pregnant, and in fact, Dee arranged for the marriage and housed them in his house as they did their work together. And Kelly's wife served as a servant to Dee's wife during those periods. So we keep looping it down, just like a perfect Mercury retrograde. We'll keep recursing back into previous themes.
Oh dear. We should have, next time we have an episode, I'm definitely going to be lighting candles to Mercury. Mercury is retrograde. Maybe we will pierce the Skype gods.
We could have to start with a remediation next time for the.
Yes, we have to start with the remediation.
There you go.
So you mentioned that in the last 20 years there have been books published on John Dee. Can you mention a few of those, or what inspired the resurgence of interest?
I'd say, probably what inspired a resurgence of interest is an explosion and a renewal in the Western mystery tradition here in the and further the furtherance of the Rosicrucian lineages, such as Golden Dawn and so forth. There are some extraordinary books. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Jeffrey James has written just an extraordinarily compelling novel based on titled "Sorcerer," a novel of Queen Elizabeth's Alchemist, and in addition to being very rich in the historical capture of the period, is an extremely well-paced novel. You were saying, Enid?
Oh, I was just saying, I think some of the resurgence is also that there's been a little bit loosening of the automatic, in colleges. For a long time, if you wanted to write about astrology, you wanted to write about the mysticism, you always had to preface it with, and of course this is bunk, and of course this is awful. And if, when you read anything from the early 1900s, well, up through 1960s and 70s even, you tend to have these academic books that will go into great detail and immediately dismiss everything they've just said. And that's relaxed. You actually have a valid way of exploring this material these days, and it's okay to do so.
Yeah,
So I
especially
think
with the resurgence of programs, I would think, in esoteric studies that some of the schools in Europe have, like it's the Sorbonne or I think it's Exeter, that they're producing graduate students. And we know how graduate students love to do research that can start the kernel for some of these new books, perhaps.
You know, I
think
was
that's part of it.
doing some PhD work and writing some papers for a course. I had done a concentration in leadership as an extension, actually, of some work I was doing on medical epistemology, how we build knowledge in medicine, and I was able in the
Okay, well, we are having
historic
problems
leaders.
with the
I
audience.
select Queen Elizabeth I in particular because of her use of John Dee.
Oh, yes. Okay, back. See,
We
I'm not
lost
sure where
you
it
there
fell
for a
off,
minute.
but okay. Well, yeah, just agreeing to your point, Enid, that I actually delivered a paper in a PhD program on I was doing a concentration on leadership, and I used Queen Elizabeth I as the model and her application of knowledge that she gained through John Dee, both through the sciences and through espionage, but also through the application of esoteric arts such as astrology and alchemy, and they accepted that paper.
Yeah, and it does seem that once the door got opened for some of that stuff being opened, graduate students, how can they resist? And I also think that perhaps in some of the loosening of some of the Christian side, where that is a totally taboo thing, not only on science, but on a lot of Christian denominations to look into the esoteric side. And some of that has also been loosened, and I think that's also playing out in why we're hearing a lot more about the fact that these pillars of science or pillars of the time also had these occult sides to them.
See, once again, we've had an hour just fly by, poof, gone, and
Yeah.
it's even hard
In
to
spite of
wrap up.
Mercury retrograde.
So I just wanted to thank you both. I love you both dearly for taking the time in our grand retrograde experience of talking about one of my favorite astrologers. We all know I have a soft spot for astrologer, magician, scholars who love books, and he would be one of them. So, and I found out today that his ascendant is conjunct mine, so there's probably a reason why I have a special place in my heart for John Dee. So thank you very much. Why don't you both take a minute to tell people how they can get in touch with you, starting with you, Enid.
Well, you can get in touch with me through Kepler College. That's www.kepler.edu.
And what is Kepler College?
And Kepler is it is a certificate program in in-depth learning of astrology, and all about astrology, not only just how to do it, but also its history and how it works.
Excellent. Will?
Very good. One could just Google Will Morris acupuncture, and that would work, or WMORRIS, WMorris33 @gmail.com. Either way works very well.
And you are working on a couple books right now?
I do. I'm working on a few books. One's called A Comparative Materia Medica. Another one is a pulse diagnosis book for the practice of Chinese medicine, and then another on medical astrology.
Excellent.
Those are the three in works right now.
Well, our time is over again. You may find us at the Dead Astrologers Society on Facebook at Dead Astrologer Society, or on Twitter at just plain old Dead Astrologers. My name is Donna Woodwell. I have enjoyed being your host for the evening, and I hope you have a fabulous night. Tune back in next week when we are talking about the history of evolutionary astrology. I'm looking forward to it.